Hi, I'm Tanya Das, Associate Director of Energy Innovation at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Our energy program focuses on designing and advancing evidence-based, effective federal policies to responsibly drive the transition to a net zero economy in a way that promotes economic growth and competitiveness and ensures that American families and businesses have access to affordable, reliable energy. Today's event is all about the timely and complex topic of supply chains. At this fraught moment in history with rising geopolitical tensions, our national security is top of mind. And we're reminded on how much our nation is interconnected across the globe in terms of the materials and products that help us live our everyday modern lives. Rewinding back a year, just a month after assuming office in 2021, President Biden released an executive order that called for a series of supply chain assessments to map out a path forward for our nation in key industrial sectors. Today, we have senior officials joining us from the US Department of Energy and the US Department of Commerce to tell us more about the Biden administration's approach to building secure and resilient supply chains. As a reminder for our audience, you can submit questions during the event using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using #BPCLive. Now I'll go ahead and introduce the two panelists. Our first guest is Dr. Vanessa Chan, who is the Chief Commercialization Officer for the Department of Energy and Director of the Office of Technology Transitions, which is focused on accelerating commercial deployment of research at the DOE National Labs and adopting a data-driven analytical approach to decision-making in the federal government. Vanessa spent over a decade at McKinsey and is an entrepreneur who once pitched her idea of tangle-free headphones on the Today Show. Welcome, Vanessa.
Thanks, Tanya, for having me.
Great to have you. And our second guest is Mr. Sree Ramaswamy, who is the Senior Advisor to the Secretary at the Department of Commerce, which plays a very important and multifaceted role in supporting our nation's supply chains through a wide variety of programs focused on trade, job creation, and economic growth, to name a few. Sree spent over a decade at the McKinsey Global Institute, leading research on trends in competition, technology, and global forces influencing multinational corporations. Welcome, Sree.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Great. So let's jump right into the question. So first of all, I just want to start with a big picture question to sort of frame what we're talking about. I think people use the term supply chain to refer to a lot of different things. You know, we talk about extracting raw materials, manufacturing, distribution of goods. Can we just start off with both of you defining what you mean when you use this term?
Sure, I'm happy to start. So when I think about supply chain, it really is a system of stakeholders, technologies, activities, information, resources, to the point you made, Tanya, to really move materials, goods, and services from the production process so that you can go from raw material, intermediate components to the final product and customer, and also take into account the end of life management. And so really the key for us as we think about supply chain is how do we keep these things resilient, design them so that they're managed and operated effectively so that we can adapt to change. And this is going to be really critical, but I really think the supply chain is the entire ecosystem and the activities around it in order to convert raw materials into a final product.
That's really
Yeah,
helpful.
I think the thing I might add is, I think one of the reasons people don't seem to agree is actually that the definition does change a little bit depending on the context. So in the current situation, when we talk about supply chain shortages, that really is a goods input shortage. So there's a shortage of materials and input parts and components. In some cases, the shortage is the final products itself, right? And so, if you're a retailer trying to sell a final good, there's a shortage there. We don't hear in the current supply chain issues, we don't hear so much about service inputs being in short supply, but services are an important part of the supply chain as well, service inputs. And so when you think about supply chains broadly, it is, as Vanessa said, it's the inputs of a range of intermediate goods and services, including raw materials, all the way to semi-processed inputs. But depending on which specific supply chain and what the context is, there are different pieces of the supply chain that you hone in to identify specific issues.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I'd love to turn now to the supply chain assessments that your agencies were involved in. First, Vanessa, I'm going to start with you. So the Department of Energy released a series of deep dive assessments outlining supply chain strategies in 13 key technology areas for energy. Can you talk us through the approach that was used to develop these strategies?
Sure. And of course, we were overachievers. So, we made sure we had 13 reports and an overarching one. And there's a couple of things. First of all, we wanted to look in terms of where we did the deep dives on the technologies. Is this a technology where we have some national security issues, right? Is there exposure to supply chain risks? Can we lead to really high quality jobs? Can we leverage US capabilities? What's the potential for global trade and so forth? So there's an entire criteria to decide how those technologies were chosen. Here at the Office of Technology Transitions, my department, we wrote one report that was around, in the case of when you're trying to deep dive into a supply chain assessment, what is the work that you're doing to assess the competitiveness and commercialization, which was the title of our report. And there we outlined a 6-step process. First was to lay out the supply chain, prioritize which ones that are important for you to look at. Second was to lay out what is the actual supply stack. So if we're thinking about manufacturing today, there are certain plants that are around the globe. Understanding what the cost is for those and how much they're actually able to produce is something that you have to next analyze. Then you have to look at the demand side of it, which is what are the different applications with which this output is being used for, understand the price points, the value, and the overall volume for that. And then what you want to do is think about, okay, if we want to place a manufacturing asset in the US, what would that cost? Doing a cost model of the output of that, and then understanding where would that sit in the supply chain stack for the overall globe. And then fifth is, given that, what are some of the policies we might need to put in place in order to help drive the competitiveness? And the last thing is wargaming, which goes to the adaptation, because in the end, all these supply chains are real and live, and there's going to be global responses. So understanding if we're to create a US asset, what might the competitive responses be? And so really what we're excited about is, there's a kind of analytical approach that we're taking to help us decide, where we can be most competitive. And so that's really what we're focused here at OTT, is to think about ways we can help drive that analysis.
I'm very excited to pull on some of those threads that you just mentioned, because each one of those steps is so important. I'd love to know, actually, from Sree, from you as well, if you could outline in the assessment that you all undertook, what was the approach that you all took to that?
I think it's similar to the approach that Vanessa laid out. I think one of the things that one of the ways we thought about it was to take, I guess, kind of two broad categories. There's the mature supply chains, where the vulnerabilities are really around smaller, mid-sized companies, for instance, or there's been kind of a lack of investment, or there's been a flight of capital and flight of capabilities to other locations. Often those parts of the supply chains are heavily commoditized, which means there are massive economies of scale, which means there's kind of one supplier, in some remote part of the world, and that's where the risk comes from. And so there's a bunch of these kind of supply chains where you see that kind of risk emerging. And then there's a different set of supply chains, I think similar to the framework that Vanessa laid out, where these are kind of emerging technologies, emerging capabilities, where we don't quite have, I think, all the resources, all the infrastructure that we need to make sure that those supply chains really are resilient, and that any new technologies or new processes that are emerging through those supply chains are actually coming to scale here in the US, or coming to scale in some kind of broader allied economy. And so we did look at, I think, when you look at some of the work that has been put out as part of the executive order reports that came out, the 100-day reports that came out last year, the one-year reports that came out last month, you do see that kind of theme emerging. There are some cases where this is mature commoditized inputs that are vulnerable for certain reasons, and then there's other cases where there's these emerging technologies that are vulnerable for a different set of reasons.
That's really helpful to hear. And, I think that one thing I'd love to know from you, Vanessa, is, as you laid out, DOE had these 13 assessments. Could you comment on which of these 13 areas you think is most at risk of disruption at this moment, just given the current geopolitical context?
Yeah, and so, of the 13 assessments, 11 were deep dives into technologies. And as we know right now, there's a lot of globalness in all the supply chains, which is why we had ID'd these 11 technologies as ones we wanted to deep dive into. So it ranged from energy storage to wind, to solar photovoltaics, semiconductors, et cetera. And all these were ID'd because there are some pinch points in the supply chain that we have to be aware of. And so, I hesitate to say, it's this one or it's this one, because we have 11 of them. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to tease all of you and say, you really should read these reports. They were thoughtfully done. The answers are in there, but all of them, there are some tensions that we need to be thinking about how to navigate, which is why we decided as a department to publish 14 total reports, because each of them, we had to do their own justice on it. And so it would be hard for me to say, well, is this one out of the 11 deep dive technologies? I really think all of them have things that we have to be careful of and to be managing for. And so this is my little bit commercial teaser, is go read them, and you can find them on the DOE website.
Totally fair, Vanessa. So, Sree, turning to you now, the Department of Commerce led a report on securing supply chains for industrial and communications technology industry, which we know is very critical industry, touches a lot of different areas, like underpins a lot of different sectors. And a key one is cybersecurity, right? In the context of energy, we think about cybersecurity of our electric grid. We've all read the news stories over the past several years of the hacks that have happened here in the U.S. and in other countries as well. And I know there are many other examples of these sort of cross-cutting issues that touch on both work that the Department of Commerce is doing and Department of Energy is doing. As it pertains to supply chains specifically, can you talk us through how your agency is collaborating with Department of Energy to ensure that these findings from these supply chain assessments are really being implemented in a collaborative way?
I think there's several collaborative threads that are going on, more in fact than we can keep track of. So I don't know if that's a good thing or not. Certainly, I think, from a problem diagnosis standpoint, we have, like I said, Executive Order 14017 specifically asked agencies to coordinate with one another. There was a lot of input that Commerce gave to Energy's work. There was a lot of input that Energy gave to Commerce's work. In some cases, Commerce and DHS, in this case, actually worked together on the ICTS, on the Information and Communications report. So there's that kind of collaboration, that's driven by a specific task that's issued from, through an executive order. So that's kind of one type of collaboration. There's another type, which is a little bit more, I guess, I wouldn't say reactive, but kind of it responds to situations. So one example of that is a supply chain disruptions task force that was set up by the White House, which is again an interagency task force that, depending on which month of the year it was over the last year, when you looked at if you joined the meetings of the task force, you'd either be discussing lumber, or you'd be discussing steel. You might have been discussing chicken, or you might have been discussing semiconductors. And so there is a little bit of this whiplash that's been going on, but it is an important, I think, regular cadence of a group of folks across the agency, senior folks across the agencies who have been discussing these issues and trying to figure out what you can do in the near term to alleviate some of these things. And so that's kind of a second avenue of collaboration. There's a third avenue of collaboration, which is, when you look to the Hill and you see the legislation that hopefully will be coming soon, whether that's the semiconductor program or the supply chain resiliency program, or other programs that are being debated on the Hill, there's collaborations going on across the agencies to plan for that kind of activity. So how would we think about the problem definition? How would we think about the amount of investment that's needed in different places? So when it comes to semiconductors, for instance, what Vanessa and I have been talking quite frequently, along with some of our other colleagues in DoD, in DARPA, and the NSF, to try to understand, what are the research needs, what are the manufacturing needs for different types of semiconductors? How would we, if the CHIPS funding were to be passed, if the CHIPS Act were to pass on Congress, and the funding were to be appropriated, how would we think about spending that money? Where do we think needs are? And again, going back to Vanessa's framework, right? Part of this is assessing the needs as they stand today. And part of it is trying to understand how the technologies are evolving, because really what you want to be solving for is over the next decade or so, how do you want to make sure that these, that if there are new gaps that might be emerging, how do you solve those today? So there's at least 3 or 4 of those examples of collaboration, and I'm sure there's more. Vanessa, I'm probably missing like 3 or 4 of our interagency meetings right there.
I mean, I will tell you that, I'm new to government, and the amount of collaboration is incredible here. I have heard, for previous administrations, sometimes things can be quite siloed. I have not felt that way at all. And it's been really amazing, these interagency working groups that have been sprouting up. And then coming out of them, there's, even other groups that are kind of working on their own to be driving things. I think example of, the joint DOE-DOT office, right, is an example of that. And so I'm really excited about this collaboration because we need all hands on deck. We can't be siloed as a US government. And I really think it's a real testament to the collaboration I'm seeing across this administration.
Vanessa, can you actually just say a little bit more about the joint DOT-DOE office for those of our viewers who haven't seen that announcement?
Yeah, so it's basically a work that DOT and DOE just have decided to do together because there's a real need to be thinking about electric vehicles and so forth. And so a lot of things coming down the pike. But I think it's an example of where we are formally deciding not to have silos by creating an office that is jointly sponsored between two very important agencies when it comes to thinking about clean energy transportation. So to me, it's just a perfect example of where we're even trying to put formal structures in place to make sure the right parts of government are working together on the right things.
That's great to hear. Yeah, it's amazing to hear creative approaches to navigating bureaucracy that make the bureaucracy work for addressing the problems that we're facing. Sree, I would love to pull a bit on a thread that you mentioned previously around semiconductors. Obviously, this is a topic that's so important right now. We're all feeling the supply chain shortages. I've been trying to get my hands on a PS5 like for a year now and still haven't been able.
Not a good time to be doing that. No.
No, it's really, it's really unfortunate. It really hampered my video game playing. But we saw this exciting announcement from Intel earlier this year, announcing that they're going to build this new manufacturing facility in Ohio. It's going to cost, I saw, around $20 billion. I saw that the state of Ohio offered around $2 billion in incentives to bring the company there. And this is, obviously a really, really exciting announcement, but this is just one investment. $20 billion is a lot of money. And we're talking about, if we're trying to reshore domestic manufacturing capabilities in semiconductors, we're going to need a lot more investments than just this one. I would love to know, how do you see this playing out? Obviously, There's a lot of money in the CHIPS Act, but I think it's $52 billion, I believe, in the CHIPS Act for semiconductor manufacturing. Can you comment a bit on how far those provisions that are currently being considered in Congress, like the CHIPS Act, the competitiveness legislation, maybe even Build Back Better, if there are some elements that could be resurrected there? Can you comment on how far that will be able to take us for semiconductor manufacturing?
Well, I mean, as you said, it is, the weird thing about this industry is that the individual investments seem like a lot of money. But when you put it in context, you realize, there's actually a whole lot more that needs to happen. So as an example, you're right, 20 billion was the investment that was announced in Ohio. If you take a step back and look at this industry globally, over the next decade, they're investing somewhere between $1 and $1.5 trillion of CapEx. And so if we're trying to revitalize the US semiconductor ecosystem and increase our share of that global pie, you quickly start to realize, yeah, it's great to get 20 billion. You're going to need several of those types of announcements to really make sure we're moving the needle over the next decade and bringing significant manufacturing capacity here in the US. So I think, as you said, it is 52 billion that is deemed to be appropriated both in the Senate version and in the House version. The numbers are similar. There's 52 billion. It's split roughly into two parts. There's about 40 billion or so for manufacturing incentives, and another 12 billion is for R&D incentives. And so the manufacturing incentives are really financial assistance, working with states and local governments to try to get semiconductor fabs to be set up here in the US. The context for that being that over the last 30 years or so, we've gone from having 40% roughly of global manufacturing capacity of semiconductors to now 12%, with most of that capacity now going to Asia. A lot of that is because there's about a 30 or 40% cost difference. A lot of that difference is because of government subsidies in Asia that account for about 70, 75% of that cost difference. That's really what we're trying to address here. Now, it's anybody's guess, whether you can actually play the subsidies game, right? And how much money you would need to play that game if we're looking at $1 to $1.5 trillion of capex. So really, I think what we're looking to do with this investment is to try to attract significant private capital to come in and co-invest with the government investment to be able to really make these large-scale fabs show up here in the US. So there are announcements being made, which is good. But we heard about Intel. Companies like Samsung have announced investments here. There's Taiwanese company TSMC, which is at this point the world's leading semiconductor chip manufacturer. They're expanding operations in Arizona. So it's a good sign. I think a lot of companies are seeing that the US is a good place to be making these sorts of investments. What we'd like to be able to do is figure out exactly how to take that 40 billion of manufacturing incentives and use it to leverage significant private capital, come up with creative financing arrangements. And so there is a request for information that we issued. I think it's been a couple of months now, and it's still out there. And I would hope anybody, folks who are listening on this call, organizations that are engaged, that are associated with the semiconductor ecosystem in any form. They don't have to just be chip manufacturers. They could be customers like Apple. They could be investors. They could be startups. We would hope to be hearing from a wide range of companies across that ecosystem to make sure that we're able to use that funding in the right way to get the capital going.
Yeah, just a quick reminder please go ahead.
I just there are a couple of other pieces. You did mention Build Back Better, so I didn't mean to interrupt there. But in the Build Back Better program, there was an associated program called the FABS Act. I have to say, this is my first time in government too, but I don't know whose job it is to come up with these acronyms for this legislation, but it's pretty interesting. It's very creative. So you've got the CHIPS Act, you've got the FABS Act, which is more of a tax incentive. It's an investment tax incentive. No idea yet how that's going to play out, but certainly we've been hearing from industry that you kind of need both the CHIPS incentives and some kind of an investment support program like the FABS Act. And that can certainly help, those two programs can work together with each other to be able to get some of those capital investments going.
That's really helpful. As a former Hill staffer, I was also sometimes responsible for coming up with those creative bill names. It's really just sitting at your desk coming up with some
It's harder than
words.
naming babies. It's really harder than naming kids, I think.
I mean, there's been so many of them. America competes, and then the competes has got a bunch of. This is amazing. This is very, very creative.
Yeah, they're very good at that, aren't they? So a quick reminder for our audience, you can submit questions using the live chat on YouTube or Facebook or on Twitter using hashtag BPC Live. You mentioned in what you were just when you were unpacking, Sree, the semiconductor incentive packages, this, the fact that Asia, some of the countries in Asia have some really strong government subsidies that they're providing to these companies that are sometimes at odds with what we're trying to do in the US. And yet in the supply chain strategies that both of your agencies put out, you highlighted the importance of supporting responsible foreign supply chains that complement what we have in the US, which I think is really an important recommendation. I think that it is important to recognize that the US can't do everything in-house, and we will have to work with our allies abroad. And yet at the same time, we need to make sure we put trust in the right partners in order to make that happen. So can you just talk to me about how we strike this balance? What is the right role for international partners as we start thinking about establishing resilient and secure global supply chains?
It's a great question. And the thing I actually love about this problem is it's one of the hardest problems to crack in terms of the multidimensional facet of it. If you ever take a look at the supply chain maps, they're all global. I mean, there's nothing that's, in one country, it's across the entire globe. And so I think the key thing here is really understanding where do we think, right, as the US, we can play a competitive role, right, create jobs and build something that is resilient. And to your point, Tanya, we can't do it everywhere, but there are places we definitely, should be exploring to go after. And then for the rest, right, then we have to think about who are the right partners, right, that we can work with so that we can have stability in our supply chain. And so it's something where, going back to analytics and so forth, Sree and I both are very analytical people. I think there's analysis we need to be doing around assessing where those are. And that was, why we did the work that we did on this EO report, was to pull together an analytical framework to make sure we're thinking about this based on data and facts, and that's really kind of the focus here. But in the end, you're right, Tanya, it's really about that delicate balance that we're trying to strike here, and it's an important one for us to get right. And so that's really the work we're doing here. But I'll tell you, having looked at some supply chains, they're pretty messy. Right. And there's some situations where you actually may be doing something in one country, flying it to another, flying it back and forth to get things done. And so there's also a question around what's the most efficient way to do things. And so there's a need to kind of relook at things with a fresh set of eyes and try to make some good decisions here.
Yeah, and I can maybe offer, just to build on that, certainly when it comes to semiconductors and this broader microelectronics ecosystem, there are a couple of things that have been going on with allied governments that maybe I can highlight, and that might give some more, make this a little bit more concrete as well. One aspect of allied engagement is on the current chip shortage, where there was an early warning system that was set up. And this was back in, I think, September, October of last year, when you had these COVID-related shutdowns in Malaysia and Vietnam. And there's a lot of chip packaging that goes on in those places. And we were hearing from companies like Ford and GM here about the fact that they were having to shut down automotive plants because they couldn't get chips, because the plants in Malaysia were shutting down because of COVID, And so part of the allied engagement is just to make sure that that kind of information flows much faster and more transparently than it currently does. You're not going to be able to shut down those, you're not going to be able to prevent the shutdowns, but if you get an extra 4 or 5 days of early warning, there are things that companies can do with that early warning that they would not have been able to do otherwise. So that's kind of one example of, can you get more transparency flowing through the supply chains so that when one country hears something or something happens in one place, that information passes quickly to other places. That's one piece of it. There's a second piece of it, which is, I think, related to some sense of a shared understanding of how this industry might be evolving, or how the supply chain might be evolving. So when it comes to semiconductors, for instance, there's always the risk of, the industry has seen cyclicality before. Demand and supply are not always in balance. Right now, there's a chip shortage. There are some concerns that if you overinvest, you may end up with a glut and prices will crash. right? And so to be able to navigate through that requires some kind of common understanding of what we think demand is going to be. Why is semiconductor demand so high? Is it really a cyclical upsurge, or is it some kind of structural change, right? I mean, those are basic things that people have to answer. And so that's the other place where you're kind of seeing a lot of this engagement with allied governments, with companies, both domestic and foreign, just to try to get a common understanding of what's going on with demand over the next decade. And that will hopefully guide, I think, at least some of the calculus around these investment decisions. Do you want to really be making investments where you think there's a threat of overcapacity, or do you want to make sure that you focus investments on places where demand is strong and is expected to be strong, right? I mean, those sorts of things. So that's just a couple of examples of how we're engaging with the allies in terms of this kind of supply chain transparency and reliability.
Yeah, clearly this problem is one that requires a lot of robust analysis in multiple different dimensions. We have one question coming in from the audience, which touches on a different aspect of this analysis from Justine Kalma. She says that a report yesterday found ports and shipping industry are susceptible to billions of dollars in damage from climate change. She's curious to know what is being done on investigating the climate threats to supply chains. Something that I also imagine, requires a lot of difficult analysis to figure out.
Yeah, so I know that, there's a need to forecast these things. I personally am not aware of how it's getting tied into it, but I do know that there are groups within the national labs that are looking at forecasts and so forth, that they're actually using it to figure out how they can support local communities. But I think to your point on ports, right, that is absolutely something that one would want to think about. And I think the key thing here is using that analysis to understand where the vulnerabilities are. And then going back to the wargaming, right, part of that wargaming step that I talk about is understanding where shocks can come into the system. And when a shock comes, how do you actually respond to it? And so naturally, the ways that, I've done this in the past is thinking about the shock into the system. And once you have that shock, what is the response to it? And oftentimes when you have a natural disaster or an event, it may take down a part of the supply chain because an asset is taken down. So you think a lot of the assets that are in vulnerable weather places in the US, those are things that you have to take into consideration. And so I think it's something which is important to key into it. And I think that's something that will be important as we're laying out where we might want to be thinking about the footprints.
Yeah, and I think I would maybe add, there's a tactical way of looking at this, and there's a more strategic way of looking at it. I think the tactical way is, look, here at Commerce, we do have NOAA, which is doing a lot of work in this space, trying to understand climate changes and trying to figure out what some of these wargaming scenarios of weather models might be. And so there's this question of, how do you engage with companies to try to understand or try to help them understand their own asset risk. And obviously, there's a lot of other work going on through other, including with, for instance, the Bank of England that's been heavily involved in these sorts of things, right? Folks like Mike Carney over there. I think on a more strategic basis, one of the programs that was part of the America Competes Act that the House passed was this thing called the Supply Chain Resiliency Program. And again, that's also being debated on the Hill. We don't know if that's actually going to pass or not. But that program really is, I guess, a way of getting ahead of some of these risks and trying to define, I think, what resiliency actually means for different supply chains and what are the types of risks against which you're trying to be resilient. So climate asset risk is certainly one of them. Cybersecurity is another one. Financial security is a third one, right? Single sourcing, geopolitical. There's a whole bunch of these risks that people have talked about. But there hasn't really been a proper formulation of the full set of risks and how these different risks manifest differently, whether you're talking about the oil and gas supply chain or the metal supply chain or the semiconductor supply chain. And then there's also hasn't really been a discussion about what resiliency actually means against those risks. People often think of resiliency as I'm going to hold more inventory. But there's a cost to holding the inventory, and sometimes holding more inventory actually makes you less resilient in some of these fast-moving industries. And so how should we be thinking about resiliency solutions against these different risks? I mean, that's kind of the basis of a supply chain resiliency program is trying to get at those sorts of questions and trying to facilitate a broader government and industry collaboration to try to get to those solutions.
Those are such great points. I love the comment you just made about the need to define resiliency, which is something that I know we talk a lot about in the energy space with respect to the grid. And it's also, just a whole open-ended question, like how do we really assign concrete numbers and terms to that? It's difficult, but it's important if that's what we're trying to measure ourselves against in terms of making progress on. Very, very important. So I'm going to turn now to another question from the audience, probably one that's been on your minds, especially recently with regards to the conflict in Ukraine and the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So this audience member wants to know how that has been affecting your thoughts around the clean energy transition in the U.S. Obviously, you put out these supply chain reports, I think before the Russian invasion, and I'm curious now if that event has really changed your thinking around this, or if you think a lot of it stays the same, even with that event having taken place.
I would say the approach hasn't changed at all in the sense that, we had baked all this mapping out where the different supplies were coming from, and therefore, inherently in there's risk associated with it. But I think what it changes now is when you understand that mapping, right, and given what's happening now, where are things, most at risk, right? And so that's really, I think the key thing is overlaying on top of it this, for example, in semiconductors, right, neon is a really important element that is used in semiconductors. A lot of it comes from Ukraine. And so there's things like that you need to go deeper into to understand what the implications will be with that. And so I think the only thing it's doing is allowing us to use the analysis that we've done, take a lens at and say, now given this, right, where are the supply chain risks even more prevalent now, and what are the things that we have to do to shore up against it?
Thank you. Sree, anything to add on that?
No, I think Vanessa's right. I mean, it hasn't changed the calculus. I think what it does is it gives you yet another data point to test the hypothesis. And I think what it also does is it gives you a little bit more of a sense of urgency, as though we needed it, of how quickly these things can manifest, right? Even things that we were all focusing on semiconductors for the last year and a half. I don't think we were necessarily focusing on neon in the semiconductor supply chain until like 2 weeks ago, And so it kind of shows you, even in things that are like front and center, you can still get caught sideways, just because these supply chains are so complex.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. And I think, another topic that is related to supply chains also very complex is the whole topic of critical minerals, right? I think when we talk about things that are ill-defined and broad, the topic of critical minerals is probably one of those that are as ill-defined and broad as supply chains, right? It shows up in so many products, so many different elements, just all over the place. We have an audience question coming in from Christine, who wants to know how you are all thinking about breaking down the critical minerals processing and supply chain for the US. How are you trying to address that? And what is the US role versus what should be left to other countries?
So I think it goes once again to the mapping of all this, right? And understanding where are the pinch points for these, and then understanding, what is the investments that we need to make? Does it make sense to make the investments here, or does it make sense to do it at a partner country? I think when you look at the critical minerals supply chains, there are quite a few steps that are focused in one country, right? And so the question becomes, is that a country that we want to have some diversity with? And so are there other places we should be thinking about trying to do that? But, those countries have to build it, or do we build it? And so I think there's a lot around understanding kind of where we think the pinch points are. And then understanding if we do end up deciding to support the building of assets in other places, like refining steps and so forth, what are the competitive reactions to it? So it goes back to that war gaming and understanding it. So I think it's a really great question. I think it's absolutely something that we are taking a look at, because the critical minerals is key to so many things. It's a fundamental input to so many of our supply chains. But ultimately what we have to think through is, once again, global supply demand balancing and where the pinch points are. And so I think if you're an economist, this is a really fun time because all the stuff we're doing is fundamental economic analysis, but that really is what this also boils down to as well.
Yeah, and I think, if I could just add to that, there's a really tough nut to crack right in the middle of this thing, which is the basic economics of production. So refining in this case, but it's a playbook that we've seen in many other industries. It's one of the reasons why we've seen our industrial base hollowing out. And it's this sense of, the East Asian model in the sense of, massive upfront investments, huge amounts of capital that go in. You get these massive economies of scale, they drive down the marginal cost of production, prices fall. And pretty much after some time, there's only one or two producers left and they happen to be in that part of the world. And so this is again one of these cases where, what does it mean to have a resilient supply chain against that? Could you really replicate that model? And what is the type of subsidies that you would need? You would need enormous subsidies, right? So how do you change the economics of that kind of playbook? I think that's really what is underlying a lot of these problems. And so one of the challenges for us, and I think we're going to use, semiconductors is a good test case of that, where we actually will have some funding hopefully soon. But we'll have to figure out, can you come up with a counter playbook where you're not playing the same game, but it's a different game, but you're going to make yourself more immune to that kind of an economic playbook.
Yeah, thank you for that. And you mentioned a few different, avenues that we can take to try to address supply chain issues, right? You mentioned subsidies. We know that the government has several tools in its tool belt. We also have, funding through loans, through grants, a whole bunch of different tools at our availability. We have an audience question coming in from Mara about specifically tariffs and the role that tariffs can play in helping to contribute to addressing supply chain shortages. Could you both comment on that? Is there any interest from the Biden administration in using that tool more?
Would you mind saying that again, Tanya? There was a little bit of an echo. What was the tool?
Oh, sure. So, yeah, I'm hearing an echo too. Hopefully our producer will be able to take care of that. But so basically, the question of how to address supply chains at the federal government level there are many federal tools available, right? We have grants, we have loans, we have subsidies, all sorts of tools in our tool belt. One of our audience members is interested in understanding the role of tariffs and if the Biden administration is interested in using tariffs more to address supply chain shortages.
So I can't comment directly on, if that's a tool I want to use more of. It is a tool in the toolbox. I think, going back to kind of this process that we've laid out, what you want to do is take a look at what the competitive position is, and then look at the different tools that you have and decide, what are the implications if you use different tools. So I think it's really hard to say, yes, in all cases we wanted to use this tool, or all cases we want to use more of this tool. It really depends, which is what makes this situation so complicated and also so interesting, is there's so many different dimensions with which you can go after. So I really think it's hard to say, yes, we want to use this tool or that tool more. It really, really, really depends on the nuances of each situation. And all of those nuances also change, as we all know right now. And so I hesitate to make any bold statements and blanket statements, because it's really more of using these things like a surgical tool versus like, as a machete. And so that's why I think it's going to depend when we have to make those decisions, what the right tool is to use at that point in time.
If I could push you a little, when do you think is the appropriate time to use tariffs? What might be a set of circumstances that might call for that?
I mean, I think it's hard to answer that in the sense that it kind of depends on what the competitive responses are. Are there opportunities to look at different ways to get the private sector to move and so forth? But and then what the responses are from the global side of it. So it's really hard to say, hey, here's the formula and playbook of you go step 1, step 2, step 3 before you get here. I really think it's something where whenever I've looked at these things, you need to kind of look at it all in totality. I wish there was a kind of a flow chart where you can go through all this and say, here's the decision. Unfortunately, these things are so complicated. There really is no flow chart to it, because every single time I've looked at these things, there's different ways that you need to frame the analysis, and a same situation in 1 year may actually look completely different in terms of your answer the next year because something has changed in that ecosystem. So I'm really not trying to kind of pass the buck on this answer, but I think by trying to make a broad brushstroke saying, hey, this is when you use it, it really is going to be misrepresenting how we think about these things.
Yeah, and I think one thing I might add to that is, I find it hard, I will be frank, I find it very hard to imagine a scenario where a single tool being used is actually going to achieve the objective. I mean, right now, what we're dealing with is highly optimized global supply chains, but they've been optimized in many different ways over time. And so whether it's just the tariff lever or just a supply side incentive or just a demand signal or just a workforce investment, I don't think any one of those levers by itself is enough to move the needle. In fact, if you look at, when you talk about tariffs, right? If you think about the supply side incentives that we've provided here in the US, I mean, there was one estimate that said we've provided, I think, 85 billion of manufacturing incentives over the last decade across federal, state, local. There's more than 15,000 programs that have done that, right? And you can kind of see it hasn't really made a difference to supply chain resiliency or to the industrial base, right? And so I don't think it's a question of when you would use one lever versus another. I think it's more a question of which tools are you going to use in what combination. And I think I don't think that has really been articulated. And honestly, I don't even know if we could even answer that question without knowing what specific problem we're trying to solve.
Sure, that's a totally fair answer. Well, thank you. I know we're right at 3 o'clock. I feel like we have learned so much today about supply chains. Clearly, this is an issue that requires a lot of thoughtful analysis and is multifaceted and is complex and is global and interconnected. And that's why, I think we are all so grateful that we have two experts like you contributing to making sure that our nation addresses this issue in the right way. So thanks so much for your time. And with that, we will end our discussion today. Thanks for everyone who tuned in.
Thanks, Tanya.